Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining another Lunch and Learn on medical device cybersecurity. My name's Alan Parkinson. I'm Managing Director of Hindsight Software, and we make a compliance assistant co-author to help early stage innovators of software as a medical device and the experts that help them. Today, I'm going to be joined by Harrison Mussell from Periculo. I will be interviewing Harrison about threat modeling and risk management, which is actually a key element of cybersecurity and something that regulators are looking for. Just before I get on to that, a little bit of housekeeping. So the previous webinars, Introduction to Medical Device Security and Software Supply Chain, are both available from the Hindsight co-author website. If you want to catch up with any particular information from those, do go back and watch them. We cover particularly the FDA and the EU MDR and how they differ on cybersecurity, which is a useful background for the topics going forwards. So we have today's session, and then our final session in the series is going to be on the 25th of June, which is security testing and verification. So we'll be covering pen testing, static analysis, and other techniques that you want to consider as part of your cybersecurity strategy. So I'd like to welcome Harrison. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Alan. So, yeah, as mentioned, I'm Harrison. I'm the founder and lead consultant at Periculo. Periculo, we're a cybersecurity consultancy, do lots of different things, but specialize in the digital health and medical device space. We're in our 10th year of business. We've been doing this for quite some time now, especially during the transition from kind of like your traditional hardware devices through to where we are now, which is a lot more of the software as a medical device side of things. So taking numerous companies through the FDA submissions, EU MDR, up to some high classifications. So yeah, I've got lots of different bits of experience as part of this process, but today I'll be focusing on the threat modeling side with you guys.
Right. So the first question is, what is threat modeling?
So before threat, I just talk about what a threat is, right? So a threat is essentially something that could materialize to some kind of harm to a system or a person. Threat modeling is essentially the process that we follow to be able to map out that process, identify threats, introduce mitigations, controls to be able to reduce ultimately the risk should that threat materialize. Threat modeling is a process that's been around for a long time. So when I started in cybersecurity, threat modeling was a thing back then. A lot of people are hearing about threat modeling in the past couple of years in the kind of medical device space, as is more of an uplift in the way that we look at security with standards like EU MDR, with FDA, as auditors and stuff are trying to get more involved and make security more of a part of it. So yeah, there's a few little nuances and things where it hasn't quite merged fully with how standards work today. Some of those things we can cover today. But yeah, it's been around for a long time. Something that security professionals have done on a day-to-day basis. Relatively new though to this industry.
And risk management goes alongside the threat modeling, particularly cybersecurity risk management. How does that differ?
So yeah, so from the risk management side of things, so everybody be familiar with the risk management standards, so 14971, 791, and the kind of risk management process we go through. Now, when you're looking at risk, it tended to be that you were looking at kind of more like reactive risk and things that were happening in your environment and how you're going to raise risks and manage them. When threat modeling coming from a cybersecurity perspective was more around like the proactive management of how you identify potential harms or impacts. So the way to think about the way that you should approach the threat modeling or where that fits in the risk management process is that at any point that you'd be conducting your hazard analysis, that's typically the time that you'd be conducting your threat modeling. So hazard analysis would be right at the start of the process. It's kind of like that shift left mindset. It's catching things as early as possible in the development life cycle. And threat modeling is similar. So it's trying to get things as early as you can, following it through the process. So risk was your very traditional methodology. You're looking at impact and likelihood of an event materializing. It's again, like very standard process. Threat modeling is slightly different. So you're looking at things like the vulnerability and the exploitability Similar, but just slightly different around specific scenarios or events that can get a bit more specific and detailed.
Just to clarify, when you say hazard, you're meaning a cybersecurity hazard rather than perhaps from a medical point of view, you'd think of a safety hazard.
Yeah, so actually look at them around the same time. So when you're looking at, and like whether we're getting into the details of it too soon, but when you're doing that initial clinical safety assessment, you're looking at hazards. That's a very good time for you to be conducting your threat modeling, because essentially all you are looking for is similar things. It's hazards relating to your systems, your software, your components, from a security perspective. So the way that I like to explain to people in terms of like, when do you do threat modeling, or when should I look at it? So what we've implemented and what we do with some of our customers is that our security team will be conducting their threat modeling at the same time that their clinical safety officer or their clinical team will be conducting that hazard analysis around patient safety and harm. Because ultimately, when you are looking at, talk about some examples later, ultimately a lot of those threats will result in a harm, and it's like, where are the synergies? How do you integrate the processes, and how do you not make one isolated from the other?
And yeah, that's great. You've mentioned that a security issue can lead to harm. And I think that's something the regulators are very aware of, and why they're pushing cybersecurity is not just protecting patient data, privacy, it's also a safety element.
Absolutely.
In
Yeah.
our last webinar, we covered a few case studies around the NHS attacks recently and how it ultimately led to harm to some patients.
Mm.
The availability of the service wasn't there.
Yeah.
So that's great. So what is sort of the key components or steps you'd need to do in threat modeling?
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll talk about the overall process that we'd follow, and then try and link it to some examples. And then there's just one of the points you mentioned around like things relating to harm, and something that I think will kind of bring this to life a little bit more. So
Yep.
threat modeling essentially is, the way that we look at it is, you're breaking down your systems, your components, whatever the aspect is that you're trying to review, into individual items and components. So this could be like software units, it could be libraries, it could be whatever that is within your piece of software or device. You break that down into small points, and then essentially you're going to follow a methodology. So there's lots of different methodologies you can follow. So there's Stride, which is what we use commonly. There's Dread as well, and you can use things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the Stride methodology, for example, is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And essentially, what you're doing is you're looking at a piece of software. So let's say, for example, you want to bring in a new change for, let's pick a hot topic, a AI generated kind of summary of some patient notes. Everybody wants to kind of bring something like that in. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to work through each one of those steps and think, okay, so is there a risk of spoofing to the thing that I'm looking to bring in, or the component that I've got? Is there any way that this could be tampered with? So looking at things like integrity of the functionality that you're bringing in. And you're going to work through those points to essentially identify any potential threats that could be that could essentially come out of or become apparent because of those things that you're looking at. Now, once you've identified those threats, which is essentially similar to like your risk scenarios, those threats, you're then going to look at, okay, well, what's the impact, what's the exploitability, essentially what's your likelihood and impact. So your traditional like 5x5 risk matrix that you'd see in your normal risk management plan, essentially you'll have something that's a little bit different. You can still follow the same matrix, but you're looking at exploitability instead, which is a little bit of a change. And again, I'll try and structure so we can come back to that point. And you'll go through the process as you would with risk management. So you've identified the threats. You're then going to look at what controls you can introduce. So those controls are going to be the things that you use to mitigate that risk. And then you're going to follow that through all the way through to the evidence of those mitigations as well. So the process itself is very similar to what you would do for your risk management and your hazard analysis. This is not an entirely new process. So for those that haven't looked at the process before, a lot of your existing practices can be reused for this from a security perspective. A couple of points to note though. So first one I mentioned is that, and we've had this come up in audits before, is that your your traditional risk matrix won't work for threat modeling, because your auditor, for example, will be looking for exploitability to be used in the way that you're looking at that risk. So if you want to chart that, so for example, if you're looking at your hazard log or your risk register, and you might have a column for it with like, what's the overall risk? It's a 5 to 25, which is an amber, green, or red risk. Essentially, you need to append to your risk management plan something around, okay, and threats will be plotted on the same chart, but exploitability is used as the same kind of number as likelihood. So it takes a little bit of time to get it right for you, but it's just something that will come up. So people will ask you, well, okay, well, threats typically use exploitability. Your risk management plan doesn't have that. Okay, how does that work? And it's as simple as adding to your plan just to say, look, for threats, we use the same matrix, but we'll just add in exploitability. So something that we've introduced to good effect for a number of different scenarios. Now, moving on from that, the next most important thing that again, you should be familiar with today from a quality perspective is traceability. So traceability is so important. When you are bringing in a new software component, a new feature, if you think about ISO 13485 audit or any kind of quality audit, one of the key things that they're going to be looking at is your traceability matrix. So how you go from your user stories, your requirements, all the way through to your verification and validation. Now, your threat modeling needs to follow that same process. So as soon as you've identified there's a new thing that's going to become part of your system, that's when you're identifying a threat, and you're going all the way through that process to the verification and validation. Now, interesting. So one of your next webinars and the points you're going to talk about is around like the testing and the security testing, and that will take you all the way through to the point where, okay, we'll take the AI note summary, for example. We've identified some threats. One of those threats is that if the information that the LLM, for example, that we're using to summarize those notes for some reason becomes compromised and the information is poisoned, then it could give you some adverse events, and it could give the wrong information to the clinician who is going to use it, for example. The control that you've introduced could be that and again, this is where it's interesting, because this is exactly what you'd pick up in your hazard analysis. It would be that, okay, we're not going to give the clinician this as this is a fact. We're going to say, this is an AI summary. It may not be accurate. You should use your own training and clinical evidence to be able to come up with a decision, something like that. And it's where you can already see, like, I've given you one example and it's almost ended up exactly the same as something that you'd expect to see as like a patient safety or hazard analysis. So they're very, very similar when you start to, particularly when you're getting into like the integrity space. Anna mentioned earlier around kind of like your confidentiality, integrity, availability, and like your risk management. When you're looking at the threat modeling side of it, and particularly with software as a medical device, and something that I think is really important is that integrity becomes a really important part of it, which you'll probably find that going through the threat analysis process, you'll find a lot more threats related to integrity that you might not have picked up on doing traditional risk processes. But then that's where you start to get a bit of an overlap between your kind of threat modeling and security with your patient safety as well. So they need to work in tandem. So kind of gone into a bit of detail there. So yeah, happy to be pulled back out.
While we're down in that low level of
Yeah.
detail, so some security situations become safety situations, and you've got exploitability and likelihood on either side from cybersecurity and safety. Is there an easy way to map between those two when you actually do connect those hazards up?
Yeah, so I would say that when we introduce this and do this today, we essentially we reflect the risk matrices. So we have, say, for example, like a 5x5 likelihood and impact risk matrix, and then we will have the 5x5 exploitability and impact matrix. So we will copy the same structure so that any one of those threats that we have still comes out into the same risk output. So we can go through the same reporting metrics. So for example, if you've got your quarterly, monthly, annual risk review, they will fit in perfectly with it so that you can then follow the same process. Otherwise, it becomes a bit of a nightmare and you've got to run two different kind of risk processes.
Okay, so if it comes out red on the cybersecurity, it's red on the safety.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Right. That's nice and simple. So you've mentioned Stride and track trees. What's sort of the easiest sort of framework for doing threat modeling to adopt for somebody new? Perhaps we've got a lot of people on this session that are thinking, oh, we're months away from submission. We haven't done any threat modeling yet.
Mhm.
They're sort of panicking. What's the simplest methodology to choose?
Yeah, so in terms of the simplest methodology, so I mentioned around the Stride methodology for conducting the threat analysis. That's the easiest one to get started with. In terms of actually conducting the threat analysis and going through that process, I said the easiest way to do it is to look at your hazard analysis or your hazard process that you have today, and essentially whether you do this in a spreadsheet or you use software for it, it's doing the same thing. So it's looking at all of your software components, your software libraries, and breaking it down to then identify essentially what are the hazards or what are the threats, and then following that same process. Okay, so what are the controls? What are the mitigations that you've got in place? What's the kind of residual risk ultimately of those things being in place? And again, going through that same process. So my advice to everybody is to follow what you know. When it comes to the audit, and I've been through quite a few of these, is that the auditors are looking for you to be confident in the knowledge that you've done some threat modeling. What they're looking for is that you followed a known methodology, an industry standard methodology, so Stride, for example, and it's then fit into your processes and you can show the traceability of when those things have happened. So try and pin them to your existing processes. Use a methodology which is open source available. You can Google it and go and find it. There are also tools that you can use. So, like, for example, we use something called OWASP Threat Dragon. So an open source tool from OWASP, which is an industry standard or an industry group around cybersecurity. And it will help you kind of break things down into components and think about things a little bit different. So it will help you identify what is an entry point, where is a storage point, and kind of like different areas of your application to then apply the relevant controls to it.
Okay. So you've mentioned about having to look at the software items, all the different components that make up the software. That means you've got to have a good handle on the software architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for a class one device, you're not mandated to have that architecture diagrams.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of teams will try and push themselves down from a class two down to a class one to avoid all this additional work. But the cybersecurity seems to undo all that.
Yeah. So one thing I'd say is that to be able to conduct the threat modeling in itself, if you wanted to do it to a very basic level, you could start to look at things at a higher level. So, for example, you could look at your application as a whole. It's very difficult to get good results from what you're doing without having to have a better understanding and break things down. Now, obviously, with software as a medical device, it's increasingly more difficult to have a class one device. Obviously, there's things in the standards and regulation that by default, your software as a medical device should be a class 2A. So trying to bring it down to class one is a difficult task in itself. For new products anyway, some legacy products is not as difficult. But the industry is moving in a way that they know that to be able to do these things properly, you do have to be able to break things down. You do have to understand your architecture. You do need to understand how these things work. I think the regulators are looking at it as pretty much anything to do with software is risky. Therefore, you have to meet these standards. And again, one thing I will say is that if you implement the processes properly, there's not a huge amount of impact to the organization if you manage to integrate it with your day-to-day processes. We have seen cases where people kind of overthink it, end up running these like concurrent processes, have teams working in isolation. When it comes to, again, like all these things culminating with an audit, when it comes to that audit, if you don't have that good traceability, you don't have that integration between processes, you end up with two different people kind of talking about the same thing, not quite being aligned, and it just doesn't really show the best light of your organization. So yeah, bring it together, kind of integrating your processes a bit more, and running things together is a really impactful way of doing it.
Okay. So you mentioned about having the threat register, the risk register, the traceability. Is there any other documents that the regulators are looking for to support?
Yeah, so in my experience, it depends on your auditor. So we've had different experiences with different auditors. Now, the in terms of like minimal documentation, so having essentially the traceability to be able to show that every one of your user requirements has got an associated threat or security risk associated to it. That's the bare minimum. This is what you need to have. From a procedural perspective, standard things like they're expecting you to have a procedure that says about your threat modeling process. They're expected to see things like, okay, how does your risk matrix work? They are expecting to see, okay, well, how do you perform your security testing? When do you perform your security testing? And how do you gather that evidence? For the threat modeling itself, it is as simple as producing the threat model in the format that works best for you. Said we've seen it in spreadsheets. We've seen individual kind of like PDFs presented for every single threat that was identified, which is a very complicated way of doing it. Or what we've also seen is people adding it to Jira tickets. So for example, every Jira ticket kind of being that one-stop shop for the entire user requirement from start all the way through to verification and validation. And essentially, you've got subtasks associated to it for the relevant threats, linked to essentially an ID for when they're identified in the risk register or the threat register, and again, just showing all that traceability. So they just want to see that you've got that process in place and you've got the evidence for it, which again, I said, if I can labor the point enough, the evidence is so important with this. Just making sure that you do have the evidence and the kind of traceability. Every time your auditor picks a specific ticket or, like I said, user requirement, they need to be able to essentially click through. I say click through, they don't have to click, but or at least be walked through to the point where that control has been identified, and that control has been mitigated with evidence. For example, the control has been implemented, the security testing has been done. Yeah, if you don't have the traceability, it becomes really difficult.
Okay. So how often should you be doing threat modeling and who should be involved?
So in my opinion, so threat modeling, so every time you have a new requirement, you have to go through the process of threat modeling. Now, the interesting thing about threats is that threats always change. So when you start to get your process more mature, if you imagine you've got, I don't know, 30 different functions with 60 different threats that you've identified, there's lots of different threats. Now, if you, for example, one of the threats that you'd identified was that there was a certain component that had a supply chain risk. You're using some open source software. It's some soup item, and you thought there was some kind of risk because it wasn't a very well supported piece of software. In fact, actually, it was a well supported piece of software. This is something that we've seen in real life. You need to be reviewing your threats on a regular basis. What will happen is, and we've seen this before, so 3 months down the line, using a certain library that you've identified some threats with, you need to be able to review that to say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to go and check that GitHub repository. I'm going to check that it's still supported. And we've had cases where actually we've been using a piece of open source software. It's now disbanded. It's no longer supported. You wouldn't have known that if you weren't proactively managing your threats and actually going through and identifying if there are any changes. And this way, when that threat then changes, so all of a sudden something that wasn't necessarily that exploitable, the exploitability has now increased because all of a sudden it's no longer supported. It's not getting its security patches, and you've now got a component of your software that may introduce more risk, which then, as you go along the line, okay, that certain component was doing authentication. Okay, the authentication now could mean that this other threat that we'd identified is now increased in exploitability because somebody can now get access. And you can see how the process goes. So when you do it properly, it's very, very effective. There is in threat modeling a big difference between doing a tick box job and doing it properly. And doing it properly does have huge benefits, and we see it regularly. Like I said, that's just one example that came to mind whilst you're talking about it, but there's definitely a lot more.
Yeah, and that links into the last webinar we did on the software supply chain, and you can use your static composition analysis to get alerted about
Mhm.
open source components no longer
Absolutely.
being maintained. Um, so this also means that threat modeling isn't just part of the pre-market submission;
Hmm.
it's actually becoming part of your post-market surveillance.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so threat modeling is an ongoing piece of work. So like similar to your software bill of materials, your vulnerability management, threat modeling, and your threat management is exactly the same. Threats always change. It's the same with some people think with risk you can never have a closed risk because risk always changes. It's exactly the same with threat modeling. The external landscape is always changing, especially with things like the acceleration of AI. Like technology is moving so fast at the moment. And it's important for, and go back to your point, actually, who conducts this. In the size of organizations we work with, it will typically be a security team that's doing it. So the security team or the security experts will be the people that need to keep on top of that. There's also a massive part on actually keeping on top of like industry changes, industry insights, because those external factors and doing some of that external monitoring may kind of introduce more changes internally that you may not have been aware of otherwise.
Yeah. Something I've found useful is having a security expert maybe even lead the software development team in one or two threat modeling sessions,
Mhm.
partly to reinforce their training on secure software development. They learn
Absolutely.
a lot more about security doing that and can actually be proactive in making decisions quite early on. Because if you make an architectural decision that leads to a security compromise, it's very hard to come back and fix it later on. It's very expensive.
Absolutely, yeah. And if there's one takeaway from that as well, just from our experience, is that handing over your developers a secure development guidelines or OWASP secure development guidelines, okay, that might be a tick box. Actually doing a session with them, explaining to them, okay, well, actually, this is why integrity is really important because if the measurement that we're collecting from that device, the output of that was that actually somebody was going to be administered the wrong amount of a drug that they needed. Again, like people don't think of that as a security thing. But that's absolutely a security thing. That is integrity. It's a core pillar of security. And we can actually help developers understand a lot more. Whereas traditionally they'd be quite separated from what that means. And it's one of the big impacts of threat modeling is that security can get a lot more engaged in that kind of development life cycle. It's a bit more involved. Yeah, better conversations, better education all around.
Okay. So just a note for our audience, as we have Harrison here live, do ask your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll ask them directly to Harrison. We are coming towards the end. So I was just wondering, what three tips would you give somebody, a consultant or a small manufacturer, for adopting threat modeling and risk management?
Yeah, so number one, don't complicate it. Use your existing processes. In almost all cases, you'll probably have a relatively mature quality process. Security should be embedded as part of that. Don't run them as separate processes. Number two, it's really important to keep on top of kind of industry insights and how industry is changing. Just with the way that, and I mean this from like an auditor's perspective, is that auditors are essentially using the latest information that they have access to from industry. They may not fully understand it themselves, but that's what they'll use. So you need to be in line with what's going on in industry to be able to have that conversation with an auditor. Otherwise, it can get pretty difficult. And lastly, traceability. So traceability is for me actually the number one point of all of this is that you can do all these processes, you can have good threat modeling. If you cannot integrate that with your kind of traceability matrix and going end to end, you're going from a really difficult audit or kind of like minimal effectiveness through to if you have that traceability, there is a maybe I'm just a security nerd, but there's a huge amount of satisfaction that you can get from an auditor, for example, going through all of your traceability, seeing your tickets, seeing the associated threats, going and see the security testing, the penetration testing report, whatever it may be, and not really having to have a conversation about it because it's just there. So like get the traceability done right, and it just makes the whole process so easy for you.
Okay. So what one question would you expect me to ask that I haven't asked?
That's a good question. Um, Maybe like a question around like actually how much effort is required as part of this process. So like how many hours, how much input do you need to put in? And the answer to that would be that it's kind of like how long is a piece of string. If you want to do that really in-depth process, this can be multiple FTE trying to manage this process, particularly if you've got a complex piece of software. But it's absolutely doable with somebody that's kind of juggling multiple things, has a lot on their plate. You can spend a couple of hours a week on something like this and get good effect out of it as well. As I said, baking it into your existing processes, using the tools you've got available, and you can get some good use out of it.
Right. So we've had a question come in. Where are the best resources to use and to keep up to date with the latest threats and security risk mitigation strategies?
So depending on where your product is based. So if you're in the US, so you're looking to go via FDA processes. So US government, so NIST, for example, and also the FDA website has good. They kind of keep you up to date with changes that are happening. So that's where I'd be looking at first because these are the things you're going to look at from an audit perspective. For if you're European based and you're going down EU MDR, there's a variety of different resources that you can look at. So for example, the industry standards that you want to look at. So looking at kind of like anything around ISO 27001, looking around your kind of general security processes and what's there. The other good place to look at for things that are happening now, there's the MDCG cybersecurity guidance document, which is a really good one to look at, which gets updated. Now, off the top of my head, it's difficult to remember. There is actually maybe something that, Alan, if you're able to share it to the group after, but there's a bit of audit insight for you. So there's a GitHub page which actually maps every single standard that the auditors, the EU MDR auditors, will use as part of their cybersecurity audit, particularly around threat modeling as well. And it gets kept up to date. So it's open source, you can access it, and it amalgamates all the different standards and you can see all the different changes. So something that we use quite a lot, and it's something I'd recommend. It's a very heavy read, but it's the most thorough way to get prepared and keep up to date with what's going on.
Okay, I certainly can share that with everyone afterwards. We'll be doing an email out of the transcript from today's discussion and access to the recording, so we can certainly add it to that. If you do have any more questions, you've got just a few minutes left to add them. So one question I have is, you've mentioned having the 5x5 matrix, and you've also mentioned about using common sort of industry standards, because that will help with the auditor understanding. Is there any common standards for that 5x5 matrix from a cybersecurity perspective?
So not really. So ISO 27001 being like the generic ISO standard for security. Now, ISO 27001, the implementation guidance is to introduce a risk management framework to help you manage it. The risk management framework relevant to this industry being ISO 14971, 791, I always get it mixed up, which then is obviously the one that gives you the way that you manage your matrix. So that is the de facto standard for how you're going to manage risk. For threat analysis, the industry itself doesn't have this is a matrix that you should use for threat modeling. All it says is when you're coming up with essentially the score of your threats, is that you should use, and there's even different ways to do it, but exploitability, vulnerability, impact, and essentially you're timesing it together. So a lot of where this is derived from, for those that aren't familiar, is the CVSS scoring. So CVSS scoring being what you look at when you look at vulnerabilities. That's how you see if you've got a low, medium, or high or critical vulnerability. And essentially, it's looking at those aspects. So you're essentially coming up with the criticality of a vulnerability yourself when you go through the threat process.
Well, thank you, Harrison. So Harrison's from Periculo. If you need any expertise on penetration testing for medical device threat modeling, I highly recommend going to Periculo. If you need any help on your software development process, you want to any tools to implement your process and put guardrails in place at software development teams, generating your traceability reports from Jira, come to speak to us at Co-Author. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.